So, for those of you catching up, we did some back and forth consultation with MFA and some other partners on sort of the finalization of our housing bill. That's the centerpiece of our legislative agenda from the Governor's Office of Housing is our what is now called the Office of Housing Planning and Production. And that was partly a request from the Mortgage Finance Authority to help in our name clarify some of our focus. And because we are really focused on data, on coordination across state government, coordination with local governments, and with a real focus on housing production across income spectrums. We settled on that name. The bill is SB 205. I'll have hopefully by the end of the day, a fact sheet I can get out to everyone on this stuff to be able to share with people and have something to carry away from it. Just some of the big stuff, and I know folks working in this field probably know this stuff, but I think a Pew article that came out on the 21st of January really highlights that despite the entire country having housing affordability issues, ours are worse than the nation as an average, and particularly in rent and homelessness, where we're seeing more than double the acuity of our affordability issues than we see nationally as an average, both an increase in rents and homelessness. And then the real barriers around new construction, right, where the median new home price is over at 440,000, which is unaffordable to 82% of current residents in New Mexico. This thing I keep hitting on, excuse me, this is our permit production over the last 30 years. And you can see this 15 years of underproduction is what we're seeing drive a lot of our underlying issues with affordability and homelessness. And unfortunately, they're still going on. This is as of November, year on year. Building permits are down 4.1% for single family in New Mexico, one of only 5 states with a decline. And we're down 24% on multifamily permits, which is particularly worrying. And I think our big argument is we've traditionally used funding and subsidy-based approaches to tackle housing, right? But if you look at this graph, you can see how increases in development costs have driven a decrease in unit production from some of our subsidy-based housing programs. And that to us says we really need to tackle this underlying issue, which is systemic drivers of housing development cost and things like regulatory frameworks and other things that are impacting housing costs and our ability to build housing to meet our affordability demands. We spent the last year visiting with about 40 different counties, cities, tribes, pueblos, and every one of them has housing issues, and they're really different, right? You can go to a place like Raton, who has hundreds of vacant homes, which is really different than Albuquerque, which needs 30,000 homes. And so really one of the big things we're seeing is a need to be able to address these different issues and support local governments to create appropriate strategies based on their local housing needs. So really the core of this is sort of 3 big areas of work. One, data, driving a new approach to how we do housing data and how we measure outcomes from programs and how we track local government progress around housing. Statewide coordination, so really working inside government and with local governments to coordinate our housing responses, particularly around homelessness, where it's very fractured. And then technical assistance to really support local governments and regional strategies for addressing gaps in housing. So the big one on data, it's sort of the starting place. My argument is I don't think we can do housing better until we start knowing our needs better, making those available for people to see, and we create some accountability frameworks for local governments. And so we're working on a housing dashboard that will show the needs. We look at things like the Mid-Region COGS housing needs assessment for Albuquerque Metro. That's great. We need that for every small and medium-sized city in the state. We need to get all that information on a website. Then we need to start tracking back to what's actually happening in communities, where housing investments are going and where they're not going, right? And who's not getting touched by the resources we're putting out. On the coordination side, this is just a little map of the different steps along the process that someone who is unsheltered would go through to get all the different state services that they're eligible for. It starts with like a certified copy of your birth certificate at Vital Records and then has about 8 different stops before you get to housing. And from our point of view, this is something that we can do to coordinate these responses in a different way and be able to uh, get service providers back in the business of providing services and not going through bureaucratic gauntlets. But it's also just an example of like right now how we do a lot of housing work across state government in a sort of unstrategic way that isn't aligned, that isn't leveraging against the other things that the NGO and local governments are doing. So really trying to pull all these things into alignment and thinking about like, are we using long-term aging and long-term services resources to help aging people who are unhoused? Like, trying to start to create service paths that leverage these resources that are vested with different agencies to get them into alignment. I think another good example here would be like housing development workforce, right? Huge need in New Mexico. We have like a generational gap because of the Great Recession in construction workforce. So we can pull together the public education department, the higher ed department, the workforce solutions to create sort of an integrated plan, which right now they don't have, right? They have some apprenticeship programs here. They have some priorities and WIOA plans here. They have higher education programs that aren't necessarily tied across. So how do we bring all that stuff into alignment to start to work on some of these bigger structural issues that are affecting housing costs? And then a big focus for us is on the regulatory environment around housing. My joke is that we have a regulatory environment in New Mexico that traces its roots to medieval Spain. And you can see it when you look at the data for states around us and the amount of housing that's happening there and the amount of housing capital that's flowing there. The regulatory uncertainties in New Mexico are a huge reason investors are not investing in new housing in New Mexico. A Santa Fe County report from their housing plan indicated that the current approval timeline for a large scale project in Santa Fe County, which is 3 to 4 years, costs about $80,000 per unit. If you could shorten that to 1 year to 18 months. And so if we could take $80,000 of cost out of a house, wouldn't we want to do that as quickly as possible? I think the other one, good example, is sort of right sizing building codes and looking at new things like single stair and some of these things we can tackle from the building code side. But Virginia did that right size process under building code. They averaged almost $25,000 in reduction in hard cost of building a housing unit. So right there, we got $100,000 we could take out of the price of a housing unit in Santa Fe County, right? So certainly something we're working on. We have a working group. Some of the folks I think on this call are participating on that. We're sort of paused for the session right now, but we'll speed up in this, later in the spring to start looking at particularly the building code updates that's coming and some of these other things related to permitting inspections. And then supporting the local and regional solutions, right? So we're talking to all kinds of different communities, everything from standing up a homeless response in a small rural community to looking at regional strategies for homeownership in Grant and McKinley counties, or in Southwest New Mexico. I think there's a unique role that we can have at the state to sort of provide a super jurisdictional coordination. A lot of our communities just aren't big enough to stand up, say, a homeownership nonprofit on their own. So we could work to sort of look at regional strategies and capacity, things like COGS, regional housing authorities, things like that as ways of tackling this, but also doing technical assistance. So a big thing we're focused on is helping local governments improve their zoning contexts. We've had probably half a dozen cities and counties reach out to us and say, hey, we want to make our land use better for affordable housing. How do we do that? So really developing out a capacity and maybe some model documents, model land use code. We have most rural communities have a code that was made from a boilerplate 30, 40 years ago. So let's make a new boilerplate and start getting that out there. So like why the statutory authority? So we're already have informally formed this office. We have a staff of 4. We're working away on this stuff. But the governor only has 2 years left in her term. And a lot of this stuff we're looking at, like a 15-year undersupply of housing, is going to take a long time to reverse. Um, and same with, the scale of the unhoused populations across the state. This is longer term work. And so, this is about, really thinking strategically and doing this long term work, having consistency across administrations, and being able to start growing the capacity within state government to address housing issues, which doesn't really exist in any particular way. I think the other big thing that we're seeing from just like events in the last couple of weeks, um, we increasingly need capacity to backstop against the federal government and what might happen over the next couple of years. When we saw the HUD grant funding portal shut down a couple of weeks ago, we got a lot of phone calls from people who said, "Hey, we've got like a 2 week runway before we run out of funding to operate and we have to close doors." And we're talking about like facilities serving unhoused populations in the winter, right? So we need both capacity and resources to be able to backstop what may be coming at the federal level. Um, and I'll pause here for a second in case anyone has any questions on sort of the structure and the statutory piece of Senate Bill 205 and the Office of Planning and Production. And then I have just a few more slides on some of our funding requests.
Daniel, I don't see any questions in the chat. Everyone, please feel free to put them in chat or just unmute at this point. I did have a question. If you can walk us through your 4 staff and how they correlate with your legislative action buckets and the way you talked about long-term, short-term, stuff like that. I think that's smart, but I'd like to understand a little more how they tie.
Yeah, you bet. So we have just recently joining us is Taylor Cook. She's the director of homelessness initiatives. And she is just wrapping up. She's a PhD candidate from UT Austin. She did her dissertation on the Houston homelessness model, but actually comes from both serving on the board for the Balance of State Continuum of Care in Texas, as well as working for the city of Austin on homelessness programs. Has New Mexico roots. Her family has family here, so you know, jumps in pretty seamlessly to start tackling this stuff. We also have, and I think she's here, Roslyn Gallegos. If you know Roslyn, she's working as a manager of special projects for mostly homelessness stuff. Obviously, super talented person who has a lot of experience in a lot of different realms and housing adjacent realms. And then Wesley Espinoza, who's leading a data strategy for us. And so I think what we would plan on is hiring a couple more positions right away. I think one of those is sort of a local government liaison, someone who works really closely to do that outreach work, but also someone who understands sort of land use frameworks and things like that and can work with RLD and some of those processes. And then probably an admin person, hopefully, would be really good for us. But our idea is to start relatively light and really contract with people with specialized expertise. I don't think we want to create a big administrative bureaucracy. I think our intent is more like keep a small, light team with a full range of expertise, leverage agency expertise and resources where we can, and then bring in consultants to help with other pieces as needed if we get our budgets approved.
And those are intended to help with the long-term strategy, Daniel, or the short-term, or all of it? I'm just trying to
It's all
figure
of the
out.
above. So, and as you probably know, like my strategy on all policy and program development stuff is a both and, where you need some short-term stuff, you need catalytic wins. We're doing things like putting together projects, standing up warming centers, triaging federal fund delays. At the same time, we're working on bigger structural fixes, and so it's a little bit of both. I think we kind of got to hold both. I think if we're going to keep the momentum of the political will around housing, we do need some big catalytic wins. We need to show people stuff that grow the momentum around the movement. At the same time, we're doing the bigger structural work. So it's a little bit of both on every aspect of this. So we're from everything from how we're approaching um, funding things which are more short term versus some of the more regulatory changes, rules changes, things like that that we're working on. So we're really definitely focused on both.
Okay, and then we did have a question in chat. You might be going into this now, but what data sources will the department be relying on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we're looking at a lot of different data sources right now. I think the big challenge is, we mostly rely on census data, which is too old for my taste, and often is almost completely useless because of margin of error in smaller communities. So I think one of the things we're looking at, we're doing some interviews next week with some real estate data companies who have proprietary data sets, but we're sort of mapping across a bunch of different things. And I expect, um, come April post session, we'll be convening some working groups around data to establish data sharing, data quality agreement, the agreements of data quality and definitions that we need. I think our goal is to be relatively focused on how we do this in terms of like, I don't want to drown people on data. I really want to arrive at sort of key performance indicators for communities. And unfortunately, a lot of those are data we don't have. Rental housing vacancy, things like, average rents by unit size. So we'll be, and other proprietary data sets like the realtors, right? Have really good data sets that are theirs. So really thinking about how we, um, actually probably collect some data that we don't have so that we can have more timely data that tells us more specifically about what's happening on the ground.
No, that's great. I think the UI study you referenced earlier, and I have been sharing around, is a great example of what good data we need to be making some of these decisions and holding our communities accountable. Like the fact that the city, added 91,000, or I'm sorry, 31,000 jobs and some change, right? And only 9,000 units in that same time frame, which is just obviously the math doesn't math in that perspective. So it's a great data point for
Yeah.
sure.
And then local land use data, I think, is going to be the really big one. And that's proven really tricky. We've been working sort of informally to get uh, pipeline data from local governments. And it's just highlighted for us the need to really look at improving those systems and capacities in local governments. It has me fantasizing about could every land use department in the state use a unified platform so we can query data around land use rather than get really weird spreadsheets, often weeks later than we asked for them. Um, and I think we'll see drop in the next day or two. The Economic Development Department is putting forward a regulatory transparency bill that would cover both RLD and local governments around building permitting. So I think it's a start towards that direction of having them report the number of building permits they issue and the timelines that it takes to approve those building permits. Certainly we're also really interested in upstream approvals. So development plans, multi-unit approvals, subdivisions, things like that that help us tell what our future capacity for permit issuance is. So like knowing before it's too late that we're running out of a pipeline of future housing. But I think that's going to be down the road in terms of figuring out systems for that. And I think my focus, like I want to start with the things we have direct control over, which is RLD and our own licensing department, which does permitting. And there's some great data out there. Using Virginia as an example, they did a permit daylight website, which just shows you where your permit is, whose desk it's on, and how long it's been there. And that process alone shortened. I mean, it's a very small project. I think it costs them, a couple $100,000 to build this interface. Um, it shortened permit issuance by 3 weeks in Virginia, just because it's all very transparent of what's happening. So I think daylight's the best medicine in a lot of this stuff, and so I think that's another place we're going to look at. Same with like rulemaking, right? So building codes are a rulemaking process in New Mexico. The state codes set the floor for local governments, and we can really create new opportunities for local governments to adopt more progressive codes around small scale multi-unit housing and single stair housing and things like that. We'll also hopefully like, you know, looking at some of these places where we have pretty precipitous increases of cost for like pretty de minimis returns in life safety, which is sort of like the trajectory of most building codes, right? We're always making them more complex, but we're not necessarily ever doing a financial analysis that says like, does this improvement justify the cost in such an affordability challenged environment?
No, those are great examples. There's a few more questions in chat. Do you
Yeah.
want me to keep asking them
Yeah,
or
totally. I don't, because I'm full screen, I don't have the chat toggle in front
no,
of me.
I'll do that for you. No worries.
Thank you, Anita.
Yeah, so Andrea put in here, which we've talked about a couple times amongst our executive committee, and other members have asked us about this as well. So it's a big question for our coalition. In the bill, there's not a lot of language in there about apartments, duplexes, multiplexes. The less favorable term, multifamily units, we are very curious about why and why not, because that's a big issue to addressing our housing crisis.
Sure. It's certainly not because it's not a priority for us. It just, in terms of the way the language unfolded, we didn't really get into specificity of housing type. I think for us, that falls under regulatory reform, which is referenced a lot. We actually just submitted a letter of interest for a Robert Wood Johnson grant that would really look at creating some model codes that would promote small scale, multi-unit, and other sort of more equitable zoning practices. I think one of the other things we're looking at is, are there other levers we can use to get local governments to implement more less restrictive zoning around small scale multi-unit development? And I think, excuse me, um, capital funding is a really big lever that we're looking at as a way to incentivize zoning reform, particularly in home rule cities, where we don't have a direct legal jurisdiction over them, but we can think about conditioning certain types of state funding on certain types of responsiveness around regulatory frameworks. But huge fan of small scale multi-unit and just multifamily zoning in general. I think my dream is to get to some of our more sophisticated state colleagues who have requirements that local governments have sufficient land zone dense enough to support the affordability and new housing needs they have. I mean, that would be the dream in terms of the planning part of our name, to get to that level of needs assessment and then crosswalk to the regulatory and zoning frameworks.
Well, thank you. I think that's super helpful. I will just say, as having heard this conversation over decades, right? Even the example we gave from the UI study here in Albuquerque about the jobs that showed up, but the housing that did not, we all know, and so do our legislators, that jobs are a fundamental asset that strengthens our community. And here in this call, we know that so is housing. Housing is a fundamental asset that strengthens our community. So that's the kind of level of conversation, and I understand challenges with bills and language anyway. Just to say, as much as we can put it out there, I think is really important for audiences who aren't as housing savvy as this one, right?
No, it's really important. I'm actually really concerned about the lack of housing and the potential challenges that creates for economic development when we are in a period of relatively robust economic growth. We're either, we sort of have two options if we don't build enough housing to meet the demand, which is we're either going to slow economic growth or we're going to displace native New Mexicans for people moving here for these jobs. And neither one of those are really good outcomes. So we have to match with the housing. We have to center housing as a central strategy along with economic development. And I think that's happening. I mean, I think that's another place where having our office will be important in terms of like integrating the need for housing across a lot of different activities, including economic development.
That's great. Thank you. We have another question here. Is there discussion about what accountability will look like in addressing these large gaps between needs and housing units available, if you will? So like how many builders or developers will be, put out there or remedy? And this is Jordan's question, so if I'm
Yeah.
butchering, Jordan, feel free to jump on and rephrase that.
I'll give Jordan a second in
I
case.
think you kind of nailed it, but I was just kind of
Okay.
referencing the regional housing assessment. Like that gives us that data that Albuquerque needs 55,000 homes through 2045. That's to meet the backlog and like future growth. So there's, remedies other states have looked at, like builder's remedy or, taking away planning rules if a city can't upzone. Like, what are there discussions yet about what accountability looks like, or is that kind of a regulatory question for further down the road?
I mean, it's not one we've had in the day. I mean, first, let me say 100% on board. I would love not to have to get to like builders remedy style interventions, right? Because they are blunt instruments. So I think, the way we're thinking about it is sort of progressive. First, let's daylight this. You need this many units, you're building this many units. There's a mismatch. Here are technical resources to address that problem from different elements of state government, whether it be model codes, other things. A lot of those builders remedy approaches or take like Oregon's statewide planning approach. They require the state to develop certain frameworks to create that accountability, but also things like model codes to kick in if the local government code isn't meeting the needs, right? So I think from our point of view, it's a progressive approach that starts with data. It starts with developing what those like model codes and other things would look like. I can tell you from the governor's point of view, she is like out of patience for the local governments and their current approach to this stuff. And so we are exploring different things that could be levers for that. But I think for me, I just want to make sure if we do things like that, they're done right and that we've exhausted sort of the more proactive approaches versus, like we've used up carrots before we move to sticks for stuff like that. I think, first just showing what should be done. Um, and daylighting the gap between needs and action is a good starting place, and it gives us the framework to create accountability, right? And that's the thing that I don't think we have right now. We don't have good enough data to say who's doing what and comparing community to community. So for us, that's the starting point, and then we'll go from there. But yeah, I think we do need to look at interventions. I mean, we've got the similar. I mean, you talked about Albuquerque. Santa Fe has 7,000 units it needs right now in Santa Fe County, and is probably permitting a few hundred a year. So, right now we continue to build. Like I said, I mean, we shrunk year on year for permit issuance, but we're continuing to build in a way that just maintains our housing gaps, and is probably going to start losing ground in terms of economic growth. So we just need to ramp this stuff up, and we need to do it pretty quickly. So I think we'll look at it from a bunch of different angles.
Great. Andrea, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you. And actually, I just wanted to take a moment. Jordan, who actually just spoke, is with Strong Towns Albuquerque, who's a co-host of our event today. Jordan, I didn't know if you just wanted to take a moment to just say a quick word or two about Strong Towns. Yeah, and then we can go back to questions.
Sure. So, if you're not familiar with Strong Towns ABQ, we formed a bit over a year ago. The local conversation, we call it, of the Strong Towns National. So, Strong Towns has 5 basic pillars: ending highway expansion, public transparency and accounting, housing. We want abundant housing. We want better public transit. So it's kind of that urbanist sphere. In terms of housing, Strong Towns takes that approach of trying to incentivize cities to build that missing middle housing to let neighborhoods thicken up naturally, to try to spread out that growth so everyone benefits from it and that it leverages a city's assets. So we've, instead of building all these roads and sewers out into the West Mesa, leveraging what we already have that we have a deficit in paying for. It's kind of like the very, very short, basic 101 of Strong Town. We did have a housing meeting yesterday. and we've now outgrown Little Bear Coffee. They got a little angry at us, so we're gonna have to find a new place just for our housing meeting. But Daniel had mentioned those catalytic projects. I mean, here in Albuquerque, we just passed O 2469, and that got so many people on board. People were speaking at city council for the first time. There's a ton of energy about more zoning reforms we could do in Albuquerque. So I think, leveraging those initiatives really gets the energy going. So I'll back up Daniel in saying that those catalytic moments are really a really big deal.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. And thank you so much for all of the work that you all have been doing. Strong Towns Albuquerque is a really neat group, and there are a lot of folks that are very interested. I call us housing curious, very interested in the housing realm, but are not housing experts. And so, I do create citywide data strategies with cities right across the US. I'm not a housing expert. But really love organizing, really love creating platforms for learning collectively, as well as taking collective action around issues that are affecting everyday folks. And Strong Towns shares a similar ethos. And so I just wanted to give their group an opportunity to really participate more robustly in our learning sort of forums. And so thank you, Strong Towns, for joining us. So just to quickly go back to some of the questions that I saw in the chat, or the ones that I dropped. I was just curious, Daniel, if you could talk a little bit about what your vision is for community benefits agreements. And what I've seen in some other states is in medium-sized cities in particular, are sort of this drive to increase housing production, and this drive to like really attract developer investment, but that at some point hits like a tipping point, right? Where there has been a certain amount of investment that has already gotten to the city, so that the tax breaks that kind of go along with that, though they might help close the sort of funding gap for affordable housing developers, for more commercial housing developers, is they're already like profiting, right, quite a bit in the area, right? And so then cities often start to attach sort of these community benefits agreements, and also mitigation fees. And some of the mitigation fees that I've seen are related to asphalt removal in particular, to create more impervious surface. So depending on the amount of like development that occurs, you would be, mitigating that amount of asphalt as elsewhere, or planting more trees, or doing some kind of like estuary, regeneration, or whatever it may be. And so, Daniel, I was wondering if you could talk about any thoughts about that. I know some of that might be a little ways off, but if you all as a state entity were considering how those sort of packages could be attached to development projects or requirements.
Yeah, I mean, I think our first priority is obviously really providing meaningful technical assistance to local governments. Having had the benefit of working around the country on housing, I know for a fact there's tons of interesting tools like community benefit agreements that we're not necessarily using. So I think that would fall under the bucket of sort of local technical assistance for implementing sort of new models around development. I think, with all this stuff, we're always trying to just balance out, the financial cost of all this stuff. And honestly, right now, there are really big gaps in most projects, and that's why we're seeing that near 25% decline in multifamily right now. So it's always about a balance of trying to figure out how you achieve the community's needs versus, the need for housing. I think one of the big challenges that's just, an elephant in the room a little bit around housing is our lack of public finance for a lot of public infrastructure stuff. And so we actually do already put a lot of public improvements on housing development. And so that's just actually a structure that's sort of built in, right? I don't know as much about Albuquerque's development context. I've done enough projects in Santa Fe where I can tell you we are doing, all the ponding, landscaping, a lot of improvement stuff that a lot of times is more public sector and public offsite public improvements and amenities improvements that are included in projects. So it's always just a balance because that stuff costs money. I always think about like Santa Fe's requirement for pocket parks, even in very small neighborhoods, and part of me thinks, man, a couple few extra houses might be a better use, and having a fee and lieu system where you're actually aggregating and buying parklands in bigger chunks in underserved neighborhoods rather than putting sort of little postage stamp parks in every new development. So in general, I think we're trying to increase the sophistication of our land use context and regulatory frameworks. But I think we also want to maximize what we get from new development in terms of not just houses and rooftops, but other community benefits as well.
Great, thank you. Daniel, we have a question here from Miriam. She says, it appears most of the bills proposed in the session so far are focused on services and protections for unhoused and precariously housed residents suffering from the massive increase in fees, rents, and evictions. The root cause, per your very informed presentation, is housing supply. What funding for housing construction is being proposed? And how will the Office of Housing Production help get funding resources delivered throughout the state?
Absolutely. And maybe I can whip through my last few slides here and that'll touch on that subject. That's funding related stuff. There are several funding related bills moving through. MFA has asked for $500 million for the Housing Trust Fund. The city of Albuquerque is asking for $100 million for a list of about 2,100 units worth of new affordable housing development through the Middle Rio Grande Housing Collaborative, which is that nascent city-county effort. And Albuquerque hasn't asked for $75 million for homelessness interventions. And I think, the governor has some executive requests for housing. Obviously, the top line for us is our smallest ask, which is $2 million for our office. We structured that as part of the executive request so that we have that resource regardless of whether or not we get statutory authority. But that's the data dashboard, that's staffing for the office, that's consultants and contractors and technical assistance money. The governor has asked for $50 million to address homelessness issues statewide. And I think this is really important, especially given some of the uncertainty at the federal level. We currently have for this fiscal year and next fiscal year, 19.7 million. We did some sort of informal request for proposals without really trying very hard and got close to $50 million in asks. And so for us, this is about, do we have enough resources to fit into a framework to actually reverse the trends around homelessness and support existing models, grow new models? I think a big thing we're looking at are things like McKinney-Vento programs and new prevention programs that I think will be the really important piece. We have over 10,000 homeless or precariously housed children in New Mexico, and that seems like a great place to invest in terms of really being able to impact downstream costs. If we can keep families from becoming homeless, we really save a lot of investment later. So we're asking for a really big chunk of money, and our ask, the way to think about this is, our financing asks were really specific in terms of like, they are things we don't see other people pursuing, right? So, if you look at, say, housing trust funds that we've gotten something like 122 million of, just right around 1 million of that went to homelessness, right? And then all the other resources are local resources or federal resources. We get a little over $20 million a year in federal resources for homelessness. If that went away tomorrow, we want to have some resources there to be able to stopgap that. But I think on this, particularly what we're thinking too, is like, look at a program like McKinney-Vento in Albuquerque Public Schools as a best practice and say, can we amplify that program, also include some funding to do some technical assistance to stand up similar programs in other communities? Because every school district in the state has to have a list of everyone who is precariously housed or unhoused in the school district. And so it's a natural place where we can export a program statewide using existing resources. So thinking about that, can we not just fund programs, but can we have a systems layer that's documenting best practices, including funding for those entities to provide technical assistance to have other people start up similar programs around the state is how I would say that's kind of the model we're looking at. The other big one that we see, and this is really driven on two levels. One, big priority for Gov. She just sees a lot of folks in the higher end of the renter spectrum who should have been able to move into homeownership in the last few years that haven't. And that's causing a disruption in our housing system. We're doing a lot of investment in sort of demand side housing assistance. So things like down payment assistance, below market rate loans that are funded by activity bonds and things like that. But that in a supply scarce environment, that's actually can be negative in terms of price inflation. And so what we're proposing is sort of modeled after a program MFA had prior to 2013 and the Great Recession, which is a front-end development subsidy to get a new housing unit built and then have that discount pass on to the buyer is essentially like a down payment assistance. And the idea here is that we could get a lot of new entry-level below market rate home ownership. And at the same time, we're going to free up rental units. So we get a development subsidy, we get a new unit built, we get a new first-time home buyer, and then we're removing some of the, constriction in the rental market. And really, what happens because of those folks who normally would have moved into home ownership if it wasn't for the big increases in cost and interest rates in the last few years, they're pulling up rental costs, right? They're in a supply scarce environment, the price is resetting to them. And that puts a lot of pressure. And we know that's like one of the only places where trickle down economics actually happens. The bad stuff trickles down to the lowest income folks. And so for us, that's an intervention that could help solve a couple problems at once. The other funding things, there's a bunch of specific funding requests for individual projects. I think some notable ones that we've seen include Tierra Contenta in Santa Fe. That's a 1,500 unit master plan community with a 40% affordability requirement. And so they've asked for a $15 million public investment in public infrastructure there. Probably the single biggest thing we could do to ease housing prices in Santa Fe is to move that forward. And my sense is the governor is very favorable towards putting some money at that. There's, let's see, Yes Housing has a really interesting project in sort of Bernalillo County, just south. That's in a transit-oriented district. They're looking at a mixed-use agricultural hub and rental and townhome ownership project that would utilize an underutilized zoning designation in Bernalillo County, focused on the rail runner stop there. So that's one that's really interesting to us. But all corners of the state. I mean, Carlsbad is coming forward with an infrastructure request for a big public land development that they're trying to push forward. So we're seeing this from all corners of the state. I mean, Ruidoso, there's a lot of different specific asks for funding. I would love to see us get more systematic about how we fund housing rather than have it just be capital asks, have some standards around how we apply for and get that stuff funded. But I would guess that all told, we're probably in $750 million worth of housing asks at the legislature this year. This is stuff you guys all know. I don't have to tell you about investments in housing, but it's always a piece I try and drive home for elected leaders. When we fund affordable housing, we do so many different layers of benefits, whether it's increasing gross receipts tax, right? Gross receipts tax on a construction activity is about $20,000. Then you get property tax. Then when you're building affordable housing, you're putting money in working families' pockets, right? Which has a huge impact on the local economy, upward mobility, all those things. And I think ultimately other things like investments in mitigating homelessness and other things save us tons of money. Almost every community in New Mexico right now is paying for homelessness just in the wrong ways, in their emergency rooms, in their first responders. Uh, so our argument is pay upfront. Give, let's get ahead of this stuff and we'll free up a bunch of resources. So um, there's my phone number. Folks can feel free to reach out anytime. And that's Taylor's number if you're specifically working in this space with unhoused populations or things like that. I was hoping she was going to be here. She had to travel last minute today. So unfortunately, she couldn't be here. But we'll find another time to introduce her to the group because she's an amazing talent. I feel so lucky to have her on board. And she's getting amazing reception from the legislature, who is sort of, I think, looked a lot at Houston models, and so she's a very good technical expert in that way. And she's really coming from, the board of the Balance of State COC in Texas. She understands the challenges that, rural service delivery systems have and how we can better support those. So I think it's a good thing for everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you to everyone who was able to attend today. Just as a quick wrap up, I just wanted to go ahead and just preview the bill. We sent out the language on our, oops, I think I am not sharing the right screen. Oh, yeah. Do you all see the bill language up? Okay,
Yes.
great. Fabulous. So, just in case folks haven't had a chance to look at it, it's about 6 pages long. There are a number of definitions you might want to check out. And then the different sort of areas that the office plans to address and different responsibilities. And so I would make sure to take a look at the bill. It is, again, attached to our email on our distribution list. And you can also look it up on the NM Legis website. I believe it's SB 205. Is that correct, Daniel?
Yep.
Great. Awesome. And then I just wanted to go ahead and for folks that are kind of newer on the call, just highlight our website. So when you get to the Albuquerque Affordable Housing Coalition main website, resources such as recording and any materials such as slide decks or additional one-pagers and whatnot can be found under our resources tab. And so when you get to our resources tab under membership meeting files, you'll find all of the most recent events, as well as we've got meeting notes and resources from, for example, here from our last legislative panel and the priority legislation that each of these legislators listed at that presentation. And so similarly, we're going to go ahead and have the resources from today's meeting available on this page for you all to check out after today's meeting. So that's it for me. And we're about at 3 minutes till. I don't know, Daniel, if you had some last parting words in terms of how the coalition could plug in.
Yeah, sure. One, just awesome work that you guys are doing, bringing folks together around this. This is like the next step for us is we need a New Mexico housing coalition, right? To really pull together across the state. But just seeing this kind of like everyone in the same place is so great and inspiring. I think the big thing is just, get folks aware of these issues. I think, New Mexico in general is used to subsidizing housing. They're not used to really working on this systems level. And so helping them understand the regulatory frameworks, the workforce pieces, these bigger pieces to what we're proposing is really helpful. The other thing is I would expect next week, hopefully sometime, we're going to have our first hearing on this bill in the Senate Health and Public Affairs Committee. I'll do my best to try and get word out when we get scheduled. A lot of this stuff happens really quick. You can testify virtually. Oftentimes there's not a ton of time for testimony, but having one or two key people to speak to different aspects can be really helpful. So we'll work through our networks to notify everyone when those hearings happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. And we will also be sending out blasts every week. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know it was a little bit of a quicker meeting than we usually have, but Daniel, thank you so much for taking a deep dive into that bill and to some of the questions that we had from our members. Thank you all, everyone. And just as a quick plug, our next membership meeting is going to be March 12th. It'll be an in-person meeting where we'll have an opportunity for folks to vote or submit an application for joining our board. We'll be looking for about 1 to 2 positions, and then we'll be able to talk a little bit more about our upcoming year's strategy, a review of this past year, as well as a little bit of sort of on-the-spot feedback from you all. So yes, please mark on your calendar, save the date for March 12th, our next in-person membership meeting. Thank you all so much, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.